Let's think about space for a second. Cold, scary, probably full of man eating aliens. Those may be some of the words and phrases that come to mind when you think of outer space. Now, if you're anything like me, which is to say an absolute nerd, you might think space is pretty awesome. After all, who doesn't love a good sci fi story like Interstellar or Gravity? And who can't appreciate the beauty of the countless stars in a night sky? To me, the appeal of outer space comes from the fact that it represents the most absolute form of the universe: vast, dark, and above all, silent. Now, I'm sure you've heard this one countless times before, but as a kid, I was always slightly socially awkward, preferring to scrub through books instead of playing football during the lunch break, and never really extending myself beyond my cozy circle of close friends. Due to these introverted tendencies, I came to form quite a close relationship with silence, often being enveloped by its warm and welcoming embrace while buried nose deep in a good book or while spending countless hours on my favorite video games. I came to realize that silence made me feel more whole than any noise did. As a result, communicating with friends and family felt difficult, and conversations became rigid and plastic, almost fake. Admittedly, my inadequate communication skills were partly to blame. This social isolation only got worse, however, once the COVID pandemic started and had us locked inside our homes 24/7. Like many others, my only communication with the outside world was through the internet, which, let's be honest, doesn't exactly lend itself towards forming close personal relationships. So, once the pandemic was finally lifted, I was left how to figure out to socialize all over again. This all changed, however, when one day a friend invited me and a few others over to reconnect after the pandemic for a reunion of sorts. While it was certainly lively, the entire time I was racked with anxiety at having to communicate with so many people back to back. I was afraid that I'd say something wrong, or talk for too long, or too little, or I'd bore the other person by talking about this or that. Thankfully, I got through that ordeal, and towards the end, two of my close friends dragged me up to the roof, where we found a ledge to sit on overlooking the skyline. There was a cool, gentle breeze, and before us was a panoramic view of Mumbai. We could see everything from the monolithic high rises of Santa Cruz to the rolling beach of Juhu. As we sat there, letting the view sink in, I realized that I'd never really heard these two not talk for this long before. I mean, they'd always been the two most energetic, outgoing, and extroverted people I'd ever known. And yet, in that moment, they were perfectly content to bask in the silence. And suddenly, I had a revelation. We were still communicating. Perhaps not in the traditional verbal sense, but rather in a deeper, more intricate manner. Through the silence, they were communicating how they trusted me enough to share such a magical moment with them, whereas I, who was notoriously bad at socializing, was communicating how I felt comfortable enough to be around them and not create an awkward situation. In that moment, all three of us were communicating with our real selves. This experience made me realize that the deepest, most pure connections are formed through shared experiences during moments of silence. Whether that's listening to songs with a friend, watching movies together, or experiencing a sunrise on a beach while waves crash against the shoreline. When you stop talking with words, you get a glimpse into the inner self of another person. Silence helps connect people in ways spoken language simply cannot. The first language emerged thousands of years ago, and our voices took shape as we became able to communicate simple facts such as food or danger. However, nowadays, we're able to communicate much more meaning and purpose than our ancestors ever could, and languages have developed and evolved far beyond recognition. And yet, sometimes it's just not enough. There have been countless times where I've tried to convey my feelings, thoughts, or emotions, and yet I've stumbled over every single word and failed spectacularly. Through non-verbal communication, however, such as visual art or performance, you don't need to say anything. You can pack a lifetime's worth of emotions into a single fleeting moment without having ever uttered a single word. Just like any tool, silence has its versatility. While it's great for connecting with others, it's equally as useful for connecting with oneself. In fact, silence is the basis for most meditation techniques. By simply withdrawing from any external noise and turning attention inward, you can train your mental stability, clarity, and focus. Silence is also a useful tool for creativity. Studies have shown that simply sitting in silence, or in other words, being bored, leads your mind to wander, which stimulates your imagination and inspires creativity. In space, no one can hear you scream. That was the tagline for the now iconic sci fi film Aliens. It shows how silence has always been perceived as oppressive and eerie, an element of horror. But I hope that through today's talk, I have convinced you how it can be so much more. The universe we live in may be ever changing, but there are three things that it will always be: vast, dark, and silent. And by simply channeling that universal constant, that silence, can you truly experience real human connection.